Let me just go ahead and say good morning. Hi, everyone. I'm Katrina Santner. I was absent from the introduction there, but it's so great to be here. I had a very lovely drive from the Northern Virginia area. Washington County is beautiful. So I'm really pleased to be spending this session with you to talk about PreviLearn diagnostic assessment specifically for mathematics. Just take one moment here to think about 1 or 2 reasons you might administer diagnostic assessments to students. I think that was enough time perhaps for folks to think of at least one reason. So any volunteers to just share what are some reasons that you might give diagnostic assessments? So the first reason you said was so that you can understand where to place emphasis when you're teaching certain content. And the second was to help you get information about perhaps interventions for students as relates to specific learning standards. Thanks so much. Other reasons? Exactly. Know what they know and figure out what they don't know. That's great. To track their progress, to monitor their progress. I think Peggy said in the introduction, use them as checkpoints throughout the school year. So those are all great responses, and certainly that is really part of the goal for using these diagnostic assessments. So, of course, you know the goal, and I think Peggy talked about that, but really I'm here to help you understand perhaps how you can use these resources to drive student outcomes. So the specific objectives, what I want you to be able to take away by the end of this session, 2 things. First of all, I want you to be able to understand how you might select some of the diagnostic tools that we have available. So that will, we'll talk about what those are so you can think about how you might make some choices about those. And then secondly, how you might interpret the results from these diagnostic assessments in order to make decisions about how you might change instruction or refine your instruction to meet students' needs. I'll start by taking a closer look at the math diagnostic tests. We'll talk about how you might select an appropriate test. We'll look at some sample reports and talk about what kind of decisions you might make based on what you see in the data. And then finally, some words of caution and then some ways you can think about getting additional support. Okay, so starting first with what content is measured in these math diagnostic tools and what are the item types on each type of subtest. So let me say first that, at Centerpoint, we've developed these diagnostic tools to really be a resource for you as teachers and lead teachers and for the teachers that you're working with to ultimately improve student learning. So they're all computer-based. I think Glenn touched on that earlier, which is really fantastic because that should make teachers' lives easier. These aren't assessments that they're going to have to grade after administering. They're all going to give immediate results as soon as students are done completing those particular tests. We've developed 2 types of subtests for the diagnostic tools. So the first of which is math comprehension. The focus of the math comprehension tests are what you would normally think when you're assessing students in math. So it's, have they mastered the major content, and do they have the conceptual understanding and skills as it relates to the Common Core state standards. So those, will range from procedural skill to conceptual understanding to application as it aligns to the Common Core. So then underneath math comprehension on this diagram here, you can kind of see three parts. We've taken our math comprehension assessment and we've packaged them in 3 different ways. So they're not 3 different types of tests, they're just 3, they offer you 3 different ways, 3 different grain sizes for how to collect evidence of student learning. So the smallest of those being the cluster tests. So the cluster tests will give you some very focused information about a small group of standards. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these, but just as an intro here. And then the grade course tests, those are the math comprehension tests that will give you the more cumulative view to assess student learning as you've taught as you've taught more content and would give you that larger picture. And then the third sort of way that we've packaged these diagnostic tests is as progression tests. So organized, as outlined in the Common Core, by domains that span multiple grade levels. So fractions, as you know, span, starting even in grade 2, there's work that begins with fractions and then really gets heavy in grades 3, 4, and 5. So we've even developed comprehension tests that are grouped by a theme. On the other side, we also have mathematics fluency tests, which would apply to your grade level. We don't have them in high school yet, but for the math fluency tests, these are tests that are really going to focus on students' ability to perform foundational math facts with both accuracy as well as speed. So that's what the fluency tests are going to be like. So again, I think main takeaway here from this slide is that of all the diagnostic tools you have two main types, two main subtests, math comprehension, and then math fluency. So on this next slide, you actually have this first table. It's table 1 in your handout. So the purpose of this slide is just to give you a snapshot of what tests are available by grade. So you all are kindergarten through grade 5, grade 6. So the left-hand side will be what are the different subtests. And then these two columns here, K1 and 2-6, that'll let you know what's offered as well as in what format. And I'll talk about those formats in just a moment. So on the subtests, you can see the very left-hand column, we have two subtests, comprehension and then fluency. But then of the comprehension, you have sort of the three sort of packages or different ways you can assess students' math comprehension. Cluster level, grade course level, which is the more cumulative, and then finally by specific progression. And then you'll notice the next column after that, we have assessments that are both fixed form as well as computer adaptive. I think most folks probably are familiar with the differences there, but fixed form, of course, when you assign students the exact same form of the test, they're all going to take the same set of items in the exact same order. Whereas the computer adaptive test, the design of that is really to help meet students at where they're at, and this has some advantages, especially perhaps for your lower performing students. But the computer adaptive test will change based on how students answer each individual question. So two students taking the same computer adaptive test may not see the same exact items, but the result, the data that you'll get will give you the same information and should reveal something about their students' strengths and areas for improvement. Okay, so there, again, two different formats that you might assign, and we'll talk a little bit more about each of those so you can understand, okay, well, why might I want to use a fixed form versus computer adaptive cluster test? So if you're a 5th grade teacher, you can see you've got a lot of options here, and that's really part of the design here. We're trying to make these resources super flexible so that you have a lot of autonomy in what you choose to administer for students, and really that should all be based on student needs. Okay, so diving now deep into the math comprehension, I've said a little bit about the purpose again, but again, it's to get an understanding of what students' skills are and their conceptual understanding of the major content of the Common Core. I'll start by talking about the cluster test, which is that finest grain size. Then I'll move on to grade course assessments, which will be all the way through high school, and then the progression tests, which are available for grades 2 through 8. So now, before I actually get into talking about the cluster test, I just want to do a refresher, and I thought maybe there would be a variety of teachers, like beginning teachers, so I'm not meaning to insult you here in terms of terminology, but just to make sure and level set and make sure we understand what we're talking about when we say standards, domains, and clusters, just a little practice here. So if the upper box here, standards, domains, and clusters are your answer choices, I've got 3 fill in the blanks. So the first one being blank defines what students should understand and be able to do. Perhaps as a group, you all can let me know that first one would be standards. Excellent. And then the second fill in the blank here, there's a little bit of cluing to give you an idea. So blank are groups of related standards. Note that standards from different clusters may sometimes be closely related because math is a connected subject. So that second one is clusters. And then lastly, of course, then domains are those larger groups of related standards, such as operations and algebraic thinking or measurement and data. So then when we talk about reading the Common Core state standards, this is, again, just leading up to me talking about what the cluster tests are. So I've divided, just a snapshot here of the standards. And in Group A, you see this header that says number and operations in base 10. B is pointing to number 2 there, fluently add and subtract within 1,000, on and on. And then C, you've got this grouping of use, place, value, understanding, and properties of operations to perform multi-digit arithmetic. So if I were to label that section A, that would be the domain. And then in B, just pointing to the specific second bullet, that would be the standard. And then C refers to the cluster, a grouping of standards. And I want to show this because when we talk about the cluster tests, these are the building blocks that we use to build the grade and course level tests as well as the progression tests. So the cluster tests are going to be the finest grain size that you'll collect information on. So we're not assessing just on the first standard or on the second standard, but really the cluster as a whole. How can students use place value understanding and properties to perform multi-digit arithmetic? Okay, so I think I've said this a little bit already, but again, the cluster tests, they focus on the major content within the specific cluster. So you might have a cluster test, which is in grade 2, that is focusing on the domain measurement and data, and it's focusing on the first cluster or cluster A. So if you were looking at one of your charts, you would see 2MD A as one of the cluster tests, and if you assign that cluster test, it would include questions that align to standards 1, 2, 3, and 4 under 2MD. Whereas cluster test that was 2MDB would actually assess on the next 2 standards, which is the second cluster under measurement and data. Okay, so again, just wanting to really make sure you all understand that the cluster test is going to be include questions that are aligned to the standards within that specific cluster. Secondly, they follow the Common Core state standard progressions, and that will allow you flexibility to even assess students off grade level if needed, both below as well as above. And I'll show you an example in just a moment. And then most cluster tests have multiple forms. When you get to your tech session, I believe Trevor and Zach will show you how you might select, okay, I want to do Form A for this group of students, and I want to do Form B for this group of students. But you'll have multiple forms which will allow you to, have multiple administrations or really use them in some different ways. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So this should be, I think, the second table in your handout. But this table is just meant to illustrate, for your specific grade level, or for the grade levels that your teachers that you're supporting, are teaching. These are the different fixed form cluster tests that we have available for Math Comp in grades in kindergarten through grade 8. These tests average about 22 items per form, and this table shows, by code, the grade level, the domain, and then which cluster it is, cluster A, cluster B, cluster C, or whatnot, within that specific domain. So you can see kindergarten, there are 5 different cluster tests that are fixed form, with 6th grade having up to 8 different cluster tests that you can use, not necessarily just in September, but all throughout the year as it's appropriate as you're leading up to those units within the school year. So let's take a look. This version has the coloring. I removed it just because I wasn't sure about printing, but I believe Glenn and Trevor will also show you where the teacher guides are within Previ. The color-coded versions that highlight the progressions will be available there, so you can access that online. and they'll demo that for you. So if we look at perhaps one of these progressions, looking at the purple here, so that's the fractions progression that spans really grades 3 through 5, but there's some pre-work in grade 2. So if you are a grade 4 teacher and you're wanting to, you get some results, and say you have a 4th grade student who's not quite, showing mastery or showing that they're proficient within that specific grouping of clusters, you can actually assign them a grade 3 fraction test and see how they do on that. And then you can subsequently give them grade 3 fraction work. In addition, or conversely, I should say, if you have a student who is showing that they've really mastered those particular standards and they have the skills and conceptual understanding for fractions, you can even give them the grade 5 fraction clusters and see how they do with that. What's really nice is, if you're a 5th grade teacher, you're not going to be limited to just the diagnostic assessments available for grade 5. You're going to have access to all of it. So you can use off grade level assessments as you see fit. This next table, I believe, is table 3 in your handout. Same idea. There's still cluster tests, this time just grades 2 through 8. However, this time, these are the computer adaptive versions. The really nice thing, I think, about the computer adaptive versions is there are only 8 items per cluster. So in terms of, wanting to get quick information about students understanding before you teach the content, or say you've taught the lesson, you've taught your unit and now you want to know, did students master, or you want to identify which students do I need to perhaps do additional instruction and additional practice with. These are probably your go-to, these computer adaptive cluster tests, because they are so short. And they will also give you the same information in terms of, student strengths and where students perhaps need to improve. And again, it's highlighted to show your progressions, and the teacher guide will have that color coding for you. So we don't have any high school folks in here, but we do have the cluster tests for the high school grades, or really the 3 high school courses, Algebra 1, Geometry, and Algebra 2. So if you happen to have students working, some high-performing students, and you want to assign the Algebra 1, any of the Algebra 1 clusters, you would have access to that as well. So that could be an opportunity for enrichment if you have students, for which that is appropriate. These tests are 5 items each, and they're all fixed form. Each of these tests have 3 forms each. So transitioning now from the cluster tests, we're going to talk now about the grade level tests, or the course level tests, which are, of course, made from those cluster level tests. So these will give you a more cumulative view of how students are progressing, or how they have done for the entire grade's worth of clusters. So the major content of that grade will be assessed in the grade level tests. One perhaps appropriate use of the grade or course test would be if you want to take a baseline of how student strengths and areas of need in the start of the school year. That would be certainly one way to use the grade level test. In your grades, they are all computer adaptive, and in the high school courses, they are fixed form. And then finally, so rounding out our last type of math comprehension test, we have the computer adaptive progression tests. So again, progressions, they describe what students should know and be able to do within a particular domain as it spans multiple grade levels. So we've talked about we've talked about fractions, but if you wanted to follow, what are students' strengths and areas of improvement within measurement and data, you can, perhaps, if you're a grade 3 teacher, you could assign the progression test for grades 2 and 3 and see, is there a point at which I need to figure out where have they mastered so that I can know where should I start my instruction. So you may find that, okay, within the grade 2 clusters for measurement and data, they have strengths in clusters A and B, and I can start with the grade 3 work, or maybe you need to start back at that grade 2 work. So this can be particularly helpful if you have students who are on the lower performance level. I think I've said they're already computer adaptive, so these tests are going to be 8 items per cluster. So you can see there the shortest of these progressions have 3 clusters, so there'll be 24 items for that particular progression test. Again, may not use them for every single student, but as you see fit, depending on what your students' needs are. So we've spent a little bit of time talking about what are the math comprehension tests. So want to shift gears a little bit and talk about, when it comes to the logistics of actually administering. I know Glenn and Trevor will get into that, how you'll roster, how you'll assign students. But in terms of math-specific information, in kindergarten through grade 5, calculators are not permitted for valid measurement. And in grade 6 and 7, there are some clusters that will allow calculator use for all of the items in that cluster. There'll be some clusters that do not, and then some clusters then which have a mix. Students will know if a calculator is permitted because they'll see an icon. Not sure if you can see this very well, but this is what it will look like in their test. They'll see this calculator icon, which they'll just select with their mouse, and then the appropriate calculator for that particular test will pop up. So in 6 through 7, that'll be a 4-function calculator with square root and percentage functions. In grade 8, that'll be a scientific calculator. In grade 8 as well, all the tests there will have calculator items. And then in the high school courses, not so relevant for this group, but those cluster tests will either allow or not allow calculator use. We're working on getting a graphing calculator, so for the time being, even the high school courses will have scientific calculators, and for those high school courses, we would encourage students to actually have a handheld calculator. So if teachers have a classroom set, that would be most appropriate. It'll be difficult to do some of the stats questions without one. In terms of item types, and I'll show some examples in just a moment, but in kindergarten through grade 8, they'll be limited to just 2 item types. Multiple choice, your standard 4 answer choices where one answer is correct. They'll also see multiple select items. And this definitely increases the rigor for the students, right? So they'll see anywhere between 5 to 8 choices where at least 2 of those will be correct. From kindergarten through grade 5, the prompt will actually tell them exactly how many answers they should select, whereas 6, 7, and 8, we're taking away those scaffolds a little bit. It'll just say select all the answers that are correct, or select all the answers that apply. So again, K through 5 will actually specify, select the 3 correct choices, or however many it is for that item. In high school, we actually have 3 additional technology-enhanced item types: a drag-and-drop item, where they take an answer and they drag it into the appropriate drop bay. Drop-down menu, also known as inline choice, where there'll be text and then they'll have a drop-down menu from which to choose their answers, and then numeric fill in the blank. But they won't see that in the elementary grades. All the items are worth 1 point. So even the multiple select items, which will ask students to choose more than 1 answer, those are also worth 1 point. They must get all of the correct answers right, and they must not select any of the wrong answers in order to get full credit for the item. I'll also say here that students can certainly use scratch paper, and it's actually encouraged because it can help you gain information if you need to go back and investigate a little bit. I'm not understanding why this student is getting the score they're getting, and that could be an opportunity for you to interview the student, or take a look at what their steps were, if you can read their work and figure out where are the sources of misconception and error in order to move forward with instruction. So they can work in scratch paper, but they certainly have to answer their answers into the computer in order for it to score. And I think one last thing I'll say here is that for the computer adaptive tests, because they the items that are presented to them will vary based on the responses. Once they move on, they can't go back to the questions. I know there are some computer adaptive tests. I think the GRE now allows you to actually go back if you wanted to. So for these tests, once they move on within the assessment, then there's no going back to that item. All right, so let's just take a look at a few examples. Here's a grade 7 task, that is that's typical in terms of the level of rigor and the type of content that you would see, and that is called for in the Common Core state standards. This particular standard is aligned to ratios and proportions that is asking students to solve a multi-step percent problem. This next example here, this is a grade 5 example. It's multiple select, and I'm not sure if you noticed, but generally in the multiple selects, you'll see the response, it's a square rather than a circle for them to select. And in this case, they're selecting the 2 correct answers. I said sort of in the start with math comprehension, there's a mix of item types. There are items that will be more straightforward, more pure math that's asking them to perform a procedural skill. But then there are those that are also more conceptual based, and this is an example of one where it's asking students to reason about the fractions and using their knowledge of fractions and benchmark fractions to assess sort of the reasonableness of their answers. And then this third task, just have to throw in a high school one in there as well. Here's one that's asking them to complete a geometric proof. This is just a screenshot, so I'm not really showing the functionality of it, but on the next slide here, so they've got a triangle and they're being asked to prove that the interior angles of that triangle sum to 180 degrees. So I broke it up into the second part here where this is a drop-down. This is what a drop-down would look like, where they would select the drop-down to complete the rest of the sentence. In this case, there are 2 drop-down menus that they would need to get both of them correct in order to get the full point. So just to give you a sense of what that might look like. So the first one here, fill in the blank. The purpose of the math comprehension test is to measure students' blank and blank of the major content in the Common Core state standards. We're not just, wanting to see what can they do, but we want to know how can they reason about the mathematics, how can they justify how they got certain answers and why certain answers might be appropriate in making estimates. So skills and conceptual understanding of the major content. Secondly, the blank level tests assess students' knowledge and skills at the quote-unquote finest grain size. So we've talked about math comprehension tests. There being sort of 3 different ways, 3 different packages from which you can choose. So that's sort of the first bulk of information that I'll share regarding the math comprehension test. We'll now just talk about the fluency test, which is your second type of subtest for the math diagnostic tools. So the fluency tests, which are available in grades 2 through 6, these again are going to assess how do students perform with the foundational math facts. In addition to conceptual understanding, their fluency is important to assess. We want well-rounded mathematics students. So the focus here is not just on can they complete these multiplication and division problems, but can they do it with speed so that they're not having to use their brain space to think about, how do I carry the 1 or whatnot, and they're able to access the more complex math down the road. So what we've done is we've designed fluency tests that align to 11 specific fluency skills that are outlined in the Common Core state standards. So if you're looking at your standards, you would know this because each of those standards start with the word fluently. Fluently add and subtract within 100, or fluently multiply multi-digit numbers. So you would see these in the standards themselves. We've also built at least 2 forms for every fluency skill, which will enable you to really ensure that these skills have the focus that they need. The focus, again, being speed and accuracy. The reports from these tests will give you not only an accuracy score, but it will also tell you how long it took students to complete those particular assessments. And I'll show you an example of that in a little while here. And then finally, just because of the nature of what you're trying to measure, students would not be able to use calculators on these, and I think that should be pretty intuitive. Now this table, I think it's on the back of your handout. This is table 5. This will outline the 11 specific fluency tests that we would have available by grade. And similar to math comprehension, I said we have multiple forms, and that's in your second from the right, the column second from the right. And then there's some information as well about how many items per form are available for each of those specific fluency tests. And these are all fixed form. So you'll have the ability to say, I want to assign students, form A, and then do some instruction, and then check how they're doing with that particular skill. Students who have mastered, you wouldn't necessarily need to go back and assess them, but if you've done some sort of intervention, additional practice or whatnot, you can use another form of the test and then see how they're doing again. And if it's required to do additional intervention, you can certainly do that, since we have multiple forms for all of these tests. These are all resources for you, and really you could choose to even use like one last form, and say a student is really struggling, you can identify one form ahead of time that's going to be your form that you're going to use for examples, or use as a think aloud form and sit with that student and have them talk through how they're performing each of those problems. But you can certainly, you'll have the opportunity to choose, like I specifically want to assign form A to all these students, or you can even, there's an option to even have the computer assign them randomly if that's how you want to use them. But probably my recommendation is probably to assign a specific form, so you can keep track of which items they've already seen. Okay, so here's a couple of examples. So here are 2 grade 4 tasks. The one on the left is a question that doesn't require students to group. The second one requires regrouping, and you'll actually see that information in the report, and I'll show you an example of that. But all of the fluency tests, they're going to be fill in the blank. So just like these 2 examples here. And they can certainly work on scratch paper if needed. They'll probably want to until they've developed their mental math skills, but they can certainly have that option. On this next slide here in grade 6, there are a couple specifics I want to point out. So for some long division problems, if there are sort of 2 fill-in-the-blank response boxes, both of those will need to be completed in order for the item to score correctly. So this particular example has a remainder that would need to be entered in that second box. If there was no remainder, if it divided evenly, then they would actually have to enter a 0 for that item to score correctly. So that, I think that's an important thing for 6th grade teachers to share with their students. The second task here, it's an example with a decimal answer. They do need to enter the decimal in exactly in order for it to score. And what I mean by that is the value has to equate 0.021. They don't have to have that leading 0. If they choose to leave it off, it's still going to score correctly. If they choose to add some additional zeros after 0.021, it would still, it still would answer correctly. But what I mean is they shouldn't round or truncate unless it was specifically, specified in the item. All right, so another check for understanding here, this time true, false. The focus of the math fluency subtest is on speed, but not accuracy. Is that true or false? False. Wonderful. Second, students may not use calculators to complete math fluency tests. True. So switching gears now. So we've talked about the math comprehension test, that you have options in terms of cluster level tests, grade level tests, progression tests. Now we've also talked about the fluency test having, that different focus on the foundational math facts. So in terms of, selecting which tools are appropriate, this is really going to be based on your specific classroom. You've set classroom goals. Your math department or your school might have certain goals, so you will want to keep that in mind when you're making decisions about which specific tools to choose. So cluster level tests, I think I've said this a little bit, but you can use them certainly prior to instruction to understand, okay, which particular standards within this cluster do I need to add some extra emphasis? I think that was said, during our warm-up activity. It might give you information about, say you've got your unit plan and I'm spending, 2 days on this first standard and then I'm going to spend another 4 days on the second standard. Perhaps that's not, perhaps what you find is you're going to have to make some tweaks in how you pace your lessons. So prior to instruction, it can give you that kind of information. If you do it post-instruction, that'll certainly give you information about what have they mastered, what have they not, so you can go back and reteach or give additional practice or group students in different, if you have different grouping strategies, this can give you the information that you need there. And you can certainly use them in both ways, as both pre and post tests. The grade level tests, I think I said this already, but you can definitely use this to collect some baseline data for all the students in your class. Certainly, if you have students who transfer in from another district, that happens all the time, this could be another type of test that you could use just to get that cumulative view of, what do students know already going into third grade, or what might I need to reteach or provide additional support in for specific content. And certainly, if your school has, a certain after-school tutoring program or some sort of other tutoring or intervention program, these are, since they're more cumulative, that could be a good use of these grade level tests is measuring progress within those specific intervention programs. Third, the progression tests. Because they span multiple grades, this can give you insight into where to start instruction for one student or for a small group of students. You may not be giving progression tests to your entire class. It's probably not the best use of time because they are a little bit longer. This is something that you might want to use in a more targeted way. And then lastly, the fluency tests, they have a little bit of a different focus. So similar to the cluster tests, you can use them prior to instruction, after instruction, or certainly a combination of both of them. Couple more notes here about, thinking about how to choose these diagnostic tools. Again, these are all just resources that are available to you and your teachers, and it is probably not appropriate to use all of them for every single student. So really, there's flexibility in the types of tests, what format you give them, the time that you administer them, but this is really, it'll be all teacher-driven that you can make these choices about what is best for your students based on what their needs are. So there's a lot of flexibility built into these diagnostic tools. Again, I said not necessarily one size fits all. Again, it's not, we're not saying, use the test just to administer the test. You're going to get the immediate results, but be purposeful and intentional with which tests you choose to use and think about what kind of information you want to gain from that and have an idea of how you might use that information. And I think that'll be probably the best use for these diagnostic tools. And I think I've talked about the flexible design. Multiple forms are available so that you can choose, hey, I'm going to use Form A as my version that I might use as a demo in the classroom. And those are my additional set of practice items for maybe when students need additional practice after school, or maybe you're doing enrichment and you've just got this arsenal of resources, these additional items to use in your classroom really in the best way that you see fit. What do I do with the data, and what kind of decisions can I make based on the data? So in the next couple of slides, what I'll be showing you is just some sample student reports. I wasn't able to get a classroom view or a school or district view, but you'll have access to those as well. I think depending on what your role is in the school. I'm not sure if everyone will have district level, but Glenn and Trevor will show you where to access these reports within the Previ system. We'll just take a closer look at a few sample reports and talk about what kind of information you might be able to gather. So this is an example of a 4th grade cluster test. It's fixed form. Blocked out the student name, but this is a 4th grade student taking a 4th grade cluster test for NF.A, so cluster A under the fractions domain. They earned 3 points, and because every item is worth 1 point, that means they got 3 questions correct out of 14 questions. You'll also see the percentage. And then underneath, you might not be able to see it from the back, but there's also going to be a breakdown of how students performed for the standards within that cluster. So for the first standard, this particular student got 2 out of 6 questions correct, and for standard 2, they got 1 out of 8 questions correct. Okay, so in addition to sort of the overall, how did they do on that cluster, you'll get a breakdown by standard within that cluster. For the comprehension test, fixed form, we say the general target is 75% or above to know that students are likely mastering the content within that cluster. And certainly if students are below that 75% threshold, then you can work with your teacher or your lead teachers, or you all are the lead teachers. You can work with your teachers about, what can they do for that 1 or 2 specific students or a group of students within their classroom. How might you do some other flexible grouping, or how might you find opportunities to reteach specific content and then go back and do some practice with them. Here's a cluster test report, this time for a computer adaptive cluster test. You can see at the top, this is actually for grade 3. So this is a grade level test that's computer adaptive, and it's actually a grade 5 student who took the grade 3 level test. On the left-hand side, you'll see all of the clusters within grade 3, so all of them get assessed within the grade level tests, and then this middle column gives you a score. It's a decimal score this time. It doesn't tell you how many they got correct out of the total, but rather a value between 0 and 1, so it's like a probability. Scores of 0.5 and above indicate that students are likely progressing. The closer they are to 1, the stronger, confidence you can have in their mastery of that particular content. And then scores closer to 0 probably indicate students who need some additional support there. And then the right-hand column, they'll also give you a score interpretation. Do they need additional instruction, or is additional instruction and practice recommended, or is the skill successfully demonstrated? So the computer adaptive, you interpret a little bit differently than the fixed form test. It'll have a scale from 0 to 1. And then this third example, this is an example of a fluency, the results from a fluency test. In this case, grade 6 student, division of multi-digit whole numbers. You'll see the percentage correct on the very left. It'll say how many questions they answered correctly out of the total number of questions. And then again, because the focus is on not just accuracy, but how quickly they can do these types of problems, it gives you the overall time spent for that entire fluency test. And then the bottom half of this report, it's going to give you that breakdown by sub-skill. So this particular skill has been broken down into 3 sub-skills. So dividing multi-digit whole numbers, one sub-skill being a 3-digit dividend divided by 1-digit divisor, and there's no remainder, or a 3 or 4-digit number divided by 2-digit divisor, also without a remainder, and then sort of building from there, 5-digit divided by 2-digit evenly or with a remainder. So it'll give you a breakdown of how many questions they got correct out of the total for that particular sub-skill, as well as the total amount of time for that sub-skill. So it's not going to tell them how much time they spent on each question, but the total for that sub-skill. Okay, so with the time remaining, just a couple more words of caution and additional things to share when using the data. So you all have, a lot of other resources, your knowledge, what you already know about the students. These diagnostic tools are just one additional resource for you to collect information about, their learning. It really isn't recommended that you're going to give every single subtest to all your students. It's not going to be the best use of class time, and it might give you more data than you know what to do with. So, just, think about what are the goals, what is it that you're trying to learn about your students' understanding, and then go from there. So be selective in what you choose. We give you a lot of options, but just want to, caution you to just, be selective there in how you use the test. And just keep in mind, every test is just going to be a snapshot of how that student's doing on that particular day. So, if the tests are giving you results that don't jive with what you already know about that student, and, take the opportunity to investigate a little bit, have a conversation with that student, maybe collect their scratch paper, or sit down with the student, have them work out the problems, talking them aloud. So, just again, keep in mind this is one way that you can gather data or gather evidence of student learning in your classroom. Additional supports. So I think I've touched on most of these along the way, but certainly it could be helpful to collect student scratch work or scratch paper, so that you can take a look and investigate where are they making missteps, perhaps what is it that they're doing wrong, and if you need to, then you can have those conversations with individual students or small group of students. I mentioned that because most of the tests have multiple forms, what you could do is you could identify one form at the start of the year and say, this is going to be my Think Aloud form. So if there's ever a need that I have a group of students, or a single student or a small group of students, where I want to get to know what their thinking is with their approach to certain problems, you can use that as another tool for you in your classroom. And then just remember that you will have access to the other grade level tests, so you can always consider using off grade level assessments, certainly for scaffolding purposes, but certainly also for your high flyers. And then lastly, I believe Glenn and Trevor will show you this as well. I'm relying on them to do that, and I know they will. They'll show you how you can preview all of the assessments, so you can get a sense, you don't even have to necessarily use all of them for your students. You can use them in collaborating with other teachers if they're lesson planning, if you're building unit tests, or not sure exactly how your schools do that, but you can certainly get in there and look at all of the test questions ahead of time. So that pretty much concludes the information I wanted to share with you all today. So we've talked about what these what the math comprehension tests are, what the fluency tests are, their purpose. We've talked about how you might select them, and then we spent some time, especially with the activity, interpreting data and then talking about possible next steps.